Blood dripped onto the marble floor on the 38th floor of Blackridge Holdings. But it wasn't coming from the man tied to the chair. The entire room froze when a woman whose name no one in the building ever bothered to remember the night shift, janitor, pushed through the door and walked straight into a circle of 6 armed men. She stood between them and the most powerful man in Chicago, looked the traitor dead in the eye, and said, "I know what you're doing. And I'm not the only one who knows." The room went so quiet you could hear the clock on the wall ticking. What happened after that moment shook an entire underground empire to its foundation, and it all started with a bowl of soup at 3 in the morning. If this story touched you, please like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories. And comment below to let us know, do you think Maren was right, or was she being reckless? Maren Calloway was 27 years old, and she knew exactly what marble floors smelled like at 2 o'clock in the morning. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with the dust from the shoes of hundreds of people who had passed through during the day, not one of whom had ever looked down at their feet long enough to see her kneeling there. Every night, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, Maren pushed a cleaning cart that weighed nearly 88 pounds through the 25 floors of Blackridge Holdings, one of the largest financial headquarters in Chicago. She worked alone. No coworkers, no one to talk to, only the sound of wheels rolling over the floor and the hum of fluorescent lights in empty corridors. Her work began on the 25th floor and moved downward, mopping floors, emptying trash, scrubbing restrooms, wiping glass, vacuuming carpets. 25 floors, 8 hours, alone. Her broad shoulders often ached before dawn, her hands roughened by chemicals, her back throbbing dully from dragging heavy trash bags out to the basement dumpster. But Maren didn't complain. She'd never complained to anyone, because there was no one to complain to. The office workers at Blackridge looked straight through her as if she were glass. They walked past her in the hallway without slowing half a step, without nodding, without looking. She was part of the building, like a faucet or an electrical outlet, useful but not worth noticing. The night security team called her Big M behind her back. She knew because she'd heard it over the radio when they forgot to turn off the shared channel. They didn't say it with malice, but malice wasn't necessary for a name like that to cut into a person. Maren had a large body, broad shoulders, thick hands. She knew how she looked in other people's eyes. She'd known for a very long time. One night, Maren was mopping the 12th floor when an office worker came out of a late meeting room. He was holding a half-finished cup of coffee, saw Maren kneeling and wiping the floor right in front of him, then set the cup down less than 2 feet from her. Not a word, not a glance. He set it down and walked away, as though she were part of an automatic waste disposal system. Maren looked at the coffee cup. There was one last sip left inside. She picked it up, poured it into the dirty water bucket, wiped away the coffee ring printed on the floor, and kept going. Nothing changed on her face. She'd trained herself in that skill long ago, the skill of keeping her face from reacting while something inside her was burning. Maren was an orphan. Her mother died of illness when she was 14, and her father had left before that. She grew up in the foster care system, moving from place to place, none of them home. At 18, she stood on her own, and from then until now, everything she had come from these rough hands. But Maren had a secret that no one in the Blackridge building knew. Every night, during her mid-shift break, when the basement employee break room was empty and silent, she sat down in the only plastic chair that was still intact, opened a small notebook, and read. Not novels, not magazines. Maren read accounting books, thick books that office workers threw into the trash when they switched to newer editions. She picked them up, took them home, and page by page, she taught herself how to read balance sheets, understand cash flow, and tell the difference between assets and liabilities. She took careful notes in her notebook, in small, perfectly even handwriting. No one taught her. No one knew she was learning. To the world outside that basement break room, Maren Calloway was only the large woman pushing a cleaning cart through empty corridors every night. But inside the shell that people couldn't be bothered to look at, there was a mind quietly remembering everything. And that, on a night not far in the future, would change everything. While Maren Calloway knelt every night, mopping the floor on the 12th level, 40 floors above her, the man who owned this entire building wasn't sleeping either. Jericho Ashford was 33 years old, the CEO of Blackridge Holdings, and if you asked anyone in Chicago's financial world about that name, you'd get one of two reactions: silence or a change of subject. On paper, Blackridge was a real estate investment corporation, with a portfolio stretching from the shores of Lake Michigan to the suburbs of Milwaukee. But everyone knew, or at least everyone suspected, that the visible part of the iceberg was only the smallest part. Jericho Ashford's true empire lay underneath, beyond the gray edges of the law, in places where money changed hands without passing through any bank, where deals were sealed with a nod instead of a contract. That night, around 11 o'clock, the conference room on the 40th floor was still lit. Jericho sat at the head of the table, in a three-piece suit and polished shoes, without a single wrinkle. Across from him sat a man who was sweating, even though the air conditioner in the room was set to its lowest temperature. There were only 2 people in the meeting. Jericho didn't say much. He simply placed a sheet of paper on the table, pushed it lightly toward the man across from him, then said one sentence. His voice was low, no louder than an ordinary conversation, but the other man went pale as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over him. He nodded again and again, stood up, and left the room without daring to look back. The door closed. Jericho sat still for a while, looking out through the glass, where the Chicago skyline was only a blurred ribbon of lights below. That was how Jericho Ashford operated. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He never had to say anything twice. In this 40-story building, no one dared look him straight in the eye for more than 3 seconds. Not because he was brutal, but because everyone understood that behind those gray eyes was a mind calculating faster than anyone else in the room, and a will that never yielded. Jericho lived inside the Blackridge building itself, on the 40th floor, in a penthouse that took up the entire top level. He had no family, no friends, no one who called him at midnight to ask how his day had been. His phone received only 2 kinds of calls: work and problems that needed to be handled, which were really the same thing. He ate dinner alone in restaurants where guests had to reserve tables 3 weeks in advance, though he'd never had to make a reservation. He drank whiskey alone in his office at 2 o'clock in the morning, looking down at the sleeping city beneath him, and felt nothing at all. Loneliness, to Jericho, wasn't a pain. It was a layer of armor. He'd worn it from very early on, ever since his father was betrayed by a partner and died when Jericho was still young. He built everything from those ashes, brick by brick, with cold anger and iron discipline. These 40 floors of concrete, glass, and steel were the monument he had raised to his own survival. But monuments don't know loneliness. Monuments only stand there, cold, tall, and hollow inside. Every night, when the building had emptied out, Jericho often wandered through his own empire. He took the elevator down to the lower floors, walked through dark corridors, past empty offices, like a shadow inspecting its territory. He knew every corner, every door, every dark recess. But there was one thing: Jericho Ashford, the man who knew everything that happened inside these 40 floors, didn't know it all. He didn't know that only a few floors away from his penthouse, every night, there was a woman pushing a cleaning cart through those same corridors, wiping those same panes of glass, and unable to sleep, just like him. Until one night, the sound of breaking glass changed everything. That night began with a call from the night shift manager at 9:45, 15 minutes before Marin's shift was supposed to start. The cleaner for the 40th floor had called in sick. No one was willing to take that floor on, and the manager needed Marin to cover it temporarily. Marin didn't ask why no one would accept it. She knew. The 40th floor was Jericho Ashford's private territory, the place where even senior office employees stepped carefully when they passed through. No one wanted to clean up there, not because the work was hard, but because no one wanted to accidentally run into the boss at midnight. Marin only said, "All right," then hung up. She cleaned from the 25th floor down as usual, then pushed her cart up to the 40th floor. By then, it was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. The elevator opened, and the 40th floor corridor was darker than the floors below. The automatic lights already switched to energy-saving mode. Marin began mopping from the stairwell side, gradually moving toward the office at the end of the hallway, where a small sign bore the CEO's name, though she'd never read it because she'd never had to come up here before. She was mopping the middle stretch of the corridor when she heard something break. The sound of glass striking the floor, sharp and clean, rang out from behind the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. Marin stopped. Her first instinct was to ignore it, pretend she hadn't heard, and turn her cart around. But she was the cleaner. Broken glass on the floor was her job. She pushed the cart to the office door and knocked 3 soft times. There was no answer. She knocked again, then said just loudly enough to be heard, "I'm the night shift cleaner. I heard something break. May I come in and clean it up?" Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then a low voice came from inside. Only one word. "Come in." Marin pushed the door open. The office was large, but she didn't look around. Her eyes went straight to the floor, where a whiskey glass had shattered into several pieces, amber liquid spreading across the dark wood. Jericho Ashford stood beside his desk, his phone still in his right hand, his face flat and unreadable, but his jaw clenched tight. He'd just ended a call that clearly hadn't ended the way he wanted. Marin didn't look at him. She stepped toward the shards of glass, knelt down, and began picking them up one by one with her bare hands. Calmly, precisely, piece by piece, as though she'd done this 1,000 times. And in truth, she had done it 1,000 times. The fourth shard cut into the palm of her right hand. A small, shallow cut, but enough for blood to seep out, bright red against her rough skin. Marin didn't pull her hand back. She only frowned faintly, used her left hand to pick up the remaining pieces, then dropped everything into the trash bag she always kept clipped at her hip. Jericho looked down. He saw the blood on her hand, saw the way she didn't stop, didn't cry out in pain, didn't look up, searching for pity. A strange reflex moved through him. Jericho pulled the handkerchief from the breast pocket of his suit, stepped closer, and offered it to her. He said nothing. He simply held it out and waited for her to take it. Marin looked up. This was the first time she looked directly into Jericho Ashford's face. Gray eyes, cold, but in that moment, there was none of the contempt she was used to receiving from everyone in this building. There was only attention, pure and simple. A person truly looking at her. "That's not necessary, sir," Marin said, her voice soft but not weak. "I'm used to it." She stood, wrapped her hand in the industrial cleaning cloth hanging from her cart, and wiped up the rest of the whiskey from the floor. Quick, neat, as though she'd wiped away tens of thousands of stains before this one. Jericho remained still, the handkerchief still in his hand, not yet put away. He watched her work. For the first time in a very long while, he was truly looking at a person, not to measure how dangerous they were or how useful they might be. When Marin finished cleaning, she pushed her cart toward the door. Before she crossed the threshold, Jericho spoke, his voice low and slightly hoarse. An ordinary person would stop when they were cut. Marin paused without turning around, only tilting her head slightly. "An ordinary person doesn't clean offices at 2 o'clock in the morning, sir." Then she left. The heavy wooden door closed behind her. Marin stood in the dark corridor of the 40th floor, one hand gripping the handle of the cleaning cart, the other still bleeding lightly through the cleaning cloth. Her heart was beating faster than usual, not because of fear, not because of pain, but because something had just happened, and she didn't know what to call it. For the first time in 27 years, someone had looked at her and truly seen that she was there. 3 nights later, Jericho couldn't sleep again. There was nothing unusual about that. He rarely slept before 4 o'clock in the morning, and when he did sleep, it was as thin as spring ice on Lake Michigan. That night, a little before 3 o'clock, he left the penthouse, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the basement. He had no particular reason. It was simply the habit of wandering through his own building when the whole city had fallen asleep, checking each floor, each corridor, like a quiet animal patrolling its territory. The elevator opened in the basement. The hallway down here was completely different from the floors above, with a low ceiling, yellow lights, and white-painted concrete walls that had faded to gray. Jericho walked a few yards, then stopped. There was the smell of food, not the smell of fast food or instant noodles. This scent was different. The smell of slow-cooked vegetables, lightly fried onions, black pepper just taken off the heat, warm and real, like the smell of someone's kitchen. Jericho followed the scent to the end of the hallway, where a narrow door stood slightly open, pale yellow light spilling onto the concrete floor, the employee break room. He knew this room existed on the building plans, but he'd never stepped inside. He stood in the doorway and looked in. Marin Calloway sat on a white plastic chair beside a folding table, a steaming bowl of soup in a chipped ceramic bowl in front of her. A small electric pot sat on the floor beside the table leg, its lid slightly tilted, steam still rising. She was eating slowly, one hand holding a spoon, the other turning the pages of her familiar small notebook. Marin looked up when she sensed someone there. She startled, her spoon pausing in midair, her eyes widening. But she didn't stand, didn't panic. She recognized who was standing there, and the first thing she did wasn't bow her head or apologize. She only looked at him for a moment, then said, "Would you like to sit?" Jericho Ashford, the man no one in these 40 floors dared invite to sit unless he ordered them to, stood still for 3 seconds. Then he walked in, pulled out the remaining plastic chair, and sat across from Marin. The chair creaked beneath his weight. It wasn't designed for a meeting like this. Nothing in this narrow room was designed for a meeting like this. Marin didn't ask, didn't wait for him to request anything. She stood, took a second ceramic bowl from her personal bag, the only one left, ladled soup from the electric pot, and placed it in front of Jericho. He looked at the bowl of soup. Finely chopped vegetables, clear broth, steam rising quietly. He looked around. The old folding table, the white plastic chairs, the concrete wall, the flickering fluorescent light. This was probably the shabbiest place he had ever eaten in his life. He picked up the spoon and tasted it. Then he ate. He said nothing. He only ate. Marin continued eating too. They sat in silence for a long while. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, where no one felt awkward, where no one felt they had to say something just to make the emptiness smaller. Just two people eating soup at 3 o'clock in the morning in a room the whole world had forgotten. Marin was the one who broke the silence first. "You can't sleep?" she asked, her voice light, not overly curious, only the way one person might ask about the weather. "Rarely," Jericho answered. Then he asked in return, just as gently, "How long have you worked the night shift?" "Almost 4 years." 4 years. "Alone every night?" "Every night." "Why don't you leave?" Marin set her spoon down. She looked into the bowl of soup, already more than half empty, and was silent for a few seconds. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. Not bitterly, not with self-pity, just the truth, flat and still as water without wind. Jericho looked at her. He thought of the 200 people who worked under him, the ones who bowed, the ones who flattered, the ones who were afraid, the ones who calculated every sentence before opening their mouths in a meeting with him. "I have 200 people working for me," Jericho said, his voice lower than usual. "Not one of them would dare sit at the same table with me at 3 o'clock in the morning." Marin looked up. Their eyes met through the steam rising from the bowls of soup, and for the first time in many years, Marin smiled. Not the polite smile she used when the manager gave her another floor. Not the patient smile she wore when security called her by a name that wasn't hers, but a real smile, beginning in her eyes before reaching her mouth. Small, but real. "My mother used to make soup like this," Marin said suddenly, as though that smile had opened a door she had locked a very long time ago. Her name was Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan. She always said the best soup was soup made for someone you wanted to sit with. Then she stopped, as if realizing she had said too much. She lowered her head and went back to eating. Jericho didn't ask anything more. He didn't need to. The way Marin spoke about her mother, in the past tense, her voice dropping half a tone, he understood. They sat there a little longer. Neither of them said anything else. Jericho finished the bowl of soup, set down the spoon, gave Marin a slight nod, then stood. The plastic chair creaked again as he left. He stepped out the door without looking back. Marin sat alone in the basement break room, looking at the empty plastic chair across from her. Jericho's soup bowl was cleaned down to the last drop. She didn't know that that night, for the first time in many years, Jericho Ashford fell asleep before 4 o'clock in the morning. And she also didn't know that that small piece of peace was about to be crushed. But Blackridge Holdings didn't only have Jericho Ashford and empty corridors at midnight. There was someone else who didn't sleep either, and that person wasn't wandering because of loneliness. Trent Sawyer was 38 years old, the head of security at Blackridge, the kind of man whose footsteps you heard before you saw his face. He'd worked for Jericho for 8 years, longer than anyone else in the building, and he treated that as a private kind of power. He controlled every camera, every door code, every guard schedule. He knew who came in and when, who stayed late, who arrived early. If Jericho was the brain of Blackridge, then Trent considered himself the eyes and ears. The problem was, those eyes and ears had begun serving another boss without Jericho knowing it. Marin knew Trent Sawyer before she knew Jericho Ashford, and her first impression of him came from a night several months ago. She was pushing her cleaning cart across the 15th floor when she heard his voice booming from the security office. The door was open, and Marin saw Trent standing in front of a night shift guard, his face dark red, his finger pointed straight at the man's face because the guard had forgotten to log a side door during the previous shift. The guard stood still and took it, while the rest of the team stood around them, eyes lowered to the floor, no one daring to say a word. Maren stopped for a few seconds, then kept pushing her cart away. She'd seen enough. From that night on, Maren tried to avoid Trent Sawyer whenever she could. But Trent didn't avoid her. He was the kind of man who needed to know that everyone around him feared him, and Maren was an irritating exception. Every time Trent passed her in the hallway, Maren didn't lower her head. She didn't look straight into his face in a challenging way. She simply didn't bow. She kept mopping, kept pushing her cart, kept doing her work, as if he were a door she was passing by and not a person she was supposed to fear. That made him hate her. Not a loud, violent kind of hate. A slow, smoldering kind. The way someone hates a stain on the wall that won't come clean no matter how many times they wipe it. He called her Big M to her face, not behind her back like the security team. He called it loudly, clearly, every time he needed to order her to do something outside her duties. Maren didn't react. She just finished it and left. And that silence only irritated Trent more. Then came the night that changed everything. According to the schedule, Maren had to clean Trent's office on the 35th floor every Wednesday. That Wednesday night, she pushed her cart into Trent's office around 1 o'clock in the morning. The room was empty, the lights were off, and Trent had left long before. Maren turned on the light and began cleaning, wiping the desk, vacuuming the carpet, and finally emptying the trash can. When she lifted out the trash bag, she noticed that what was inside wasn't ordinary trash. There were many small pieces of torn paper, not shredded by a machine, but ripped by hand, hurriedly and unevenly. White scraps of paper mixed with takeout containers and paper coffee cups. An ordinary person would have tied the bag and thrown it away. Maren wasn't an ordinary person. She had a habit of reading everything. Over the past 4 years, she'd read hundreds of pages of documents people had thrown away, from accounting books to old quarterly reports. Her hand automatically picked out several of the largest scraps and turned them over. Numbers, organization names, arrows drawn in ballpoint pen. She set the trash bag down, crouched beside the bin, and began piecing them together. Not all of them, only the pieces large enough to read. It took about 10 minutes for her to assemble almost a full page. The contents showed that money was being transferred from an internal Blackridge account to an outside organization Maren had never heard of. The amount wasn't small, and the name of the person who had approved it on the scrap of paper was Trent Sawyer. Maren didn't understand the full meaning of what she was looking at. She wasn't an accountant, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a detective, but she'd read enough books to know that when a head of security personally transferred company money outside and then tore up the papers and threw them into a trash can instead of running them through a shredder, it wasn't normal. She stood, looked around the room. The camera in the corner of the ceiling blinked red. She knew that camera was controlled by Trent himself. Maren carefully folded the scraps she had assembled, placed them inside her inner pocket, then continued cleaning the office as if nothing had happened. She emptied the trash, wiped the desk one last time, turned off the light, pushed her cart into the hallway, and closed the door. When she got back to the basement break room, she took out her small notebook and copied the entire contents of those scraps in her small, perfectly even handwriting, then tucked the notebook into the bottom of her personal bag. She didn't tell anyone, didn't call anyone. She only wrote it down and kept it, because instinct told her that what she had found was dangerous, and the most dangerous man in this building wasn't Jericho Ashford on the 40th floor, but Trent Sawyer on the 35th floor, the man hiding a secret he was willing to do anything to keep anyone from discovering. Trent Sawyer was the man who controlled everything that went in and out of the Blackridge building, and he controlled it with obsession. Every morning, before the day shift began, he sat in the security room on the first floor, scrolling through the access card logs of the entire building from the night before. He knew who had swiped into which floor, at what time, for how long. That was how he maintained power, knowing everything before anyone else had time to hide it. And that was how he discovered that Maren Calloway had swiped into the 40th floor for 5 consecutive nights. The 40th floor, the penthouse area, Jericho Ashford's private territory. No employee below management level was allowed up there without written approval from the security department, which meant from Trent himself. He hadn't received any request. The night shift manager had assigned Maren temporarily because the regular cleaner was sick, but no one had informed Trent. And even if they had, he would still have found a way to turn it into a problem, because this was Maren. The woman who didn't lower her head. The following night, Trent was waiting. He stood in the corridor on the 40th floor at 11 o'clock at night, arms crossed over his chest, 2 night shift guards standing behind him. When the elevator doors opened and Marin pushed her cleaning cart out, she saw Trent standing in the middle of the hallway like a wall. "Stop!" Marin stopped the cart. She looked at Trent, then at the 2 guards behind him, then back at Trent. She didn't say anything. "Who do you think you are?" Trent stepped forward, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "This area isn't for people like you. You don't have clearance from security. You don't have the right to set foot up here. Give me your access card." Marin stood still. Her hand remained on the handle of the cleaning cart. Her face didn't change. No fear, no anger, no pleading. She simply stood there, looking at Trent, silent. And that silence drove Trent angrier than any reply could have. "Are you deaf or mute?" Trent shouted, stepping close to her face. "I said give me the card. From now on, you're banned from any floor above 25, and I'll report this to management to have you fired for violating security procedures." He yanked the employee badge hanging from Marin's collar. The cord stretched tight, then snapped, and the badge fell into his hand. Marin didn't react. She stood there, shoulders straight, eyes fixed forward. The security team stood frozen, no one daring to look at anyone. Trent raised the badge, his mouth opening as if to say something more. When the elevator chimed behind him, the doors opened. Jericho Ashford stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit, a phone in his hand, clearly just coming up from a lower floor. He stopped when he saw the scene in front of him. Trent standing in the middle of the hallway, 2 guards behind him, Marin facing him, the broken cord hanging from her collar, the badge in Trent's hand. Jericho didn't ask what was happening. He didn't need to. He looked once from Trent to Marin, then back to Trent. He slipped the phone into his suit pocket, slowly, then spoke. His voice wasn't loud. If someone had been standing at the far end of the hallway, they wouldn't have heard it. But Trent heard every word. "She's cleaning this floor on the night manager's order because the regular cleaner is sick. Return her card." 13 words. Jericho didn't explain further. Didn't say sorry for the misunderstanding. Didn't say check first next time. Just 13 words, and each one carried the weight of steel. Trent stood still, his face flushed from his neck to his ears, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the badge until his knuckles turned white. The 2 guards behind him looked down at the floor, trying to become invisible. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Jericho didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, gray eyes on Trent, waiting. Trent stepped forward, placed the badge on Marin's cleaning cart instead of handing it to her, not looking at her. Then he turned, walked quickly past Jericho, and led the 2 guards into the elevator. The doors closed. The corridor was left with only 2 people again. Jericho looked at Marin. Marin looked down at the badge on the cart. The cord snapped. She picked it up, held it in her hand, then said quietly, "Thank you, sir." Jericho nodded once, then turned and walked toward the penthouse. He didn't say anything else. Marin stood alone in the corridor on the 40th floor, holding the badge with its broken cord, and she knew that from this night on, everything would be different. Not different in a better way. She had seen Trent Sawyer's eyes when he was forced to return the badge. That wasn't the look of a man who felt embarrassed. It was the look of a man who was remembering. And inside the elevator going down, Trent Sawyer thought one very clear thought. Jericho Ashford was changing. The boss he had known would never have interfered for a cleaning worker. Jericho was becoming weak. And in the world both of them lived in, weakness was a gap, and gaps could be exploited. The call came at 9 o'clock the following night, when Trent was sitting in his car in the basement parking garage, before he'd had time to start the engine. An unknown number, not saved in his contacts, but Trent knew exactly who was calling. He knew because this wasn't the first time. The voice on the other end was brief, cold, without greeting. The message was very simple. Everything was about to begin, and before it did, Trent had to make sure there wasn't a single trace left on paper. Not one scrap, not one number, not one name. Everything had to disappear. Trent said, "Understood," then ended the call. He sat in the car for another minute, looking into the darkness of the parking garage, then went back into the building. He went up to the 35th floor, entered his office, and closed the door. He walked straight to the trash can beside his desk. It was empty. A new trash bag, clean and pure white. Of course it was empty. The cleaning staff had changed the trash bag on schedule, but the problem was that he remembered very clearly tearing up those papers and throwing them into this bin. He'd torn them by hand because he'd been too lazy to walk to the shredder at the end of the corridor. He'd thought paper torn into small pieces in a trash can would be safe enough. Now the trash can was empty. The papers had gone out with the trash bag. Trent sat down in his chair, placed both hands on the desk, and thought, maybe the papers had been thrown out with the trash into the basement dumpster, mixed with tons of garbage from the whole building. Impossible for anyone to find again. Maybe. But Trent wasn't a man who believed in maybe. He opened his computer, logged into the security camera system, and rewound the footage of his office from that past Wednesday night, the night he had thrown away those papers. The ceiling corner camera recorded everything. He fast-forwarded through the empty hours in the room until about 1 o'clock in the morning. The door opened. A woman pushed a cleaning cart inside. Large frame, broad shoulders, moving slowly but methodically. Maren Calloway. He watched her wipe the desk, vacuum the carpet, then move to the trash can. She lifted out the trash bag and stopped. He saw her look inside the bag, then crouch down. Her hand picked something out. He zoomed in, but the ceiling corner camera wasn't sharp enough to show clearly what she was holding. But he saw her sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, both hands arranging something on the floor, then putting it into her pocket. 10 minutes. No one sits beside a trash can for 10 minutes looking at garbage unless they're reading something. Trent turned off the screen. He sat still in the dark office for a long while. Maren Calloway, the night shift cleaner, the woman whose access card he had just ripped away in front of 2 guards, only to be forced by Jericho Ashford himself to return it. She might have seen those numbers. She might have pieced them together. She might have understood, or not understood, but kept them anyway. He needed to make sure she couldn't speak, to anyone, in any way. But he couldn't touch her right now. Jericho had just publicly protected her in front of the security team. If Maren disappeared or got fired right after that night, Jericho would ask. And if Jericho asked, Jericho would dig. And if Jericho dug, Trent's 8 years of service would become 8 years of betrayal. Trent took out his phone. He called back the unknown number from earlier. This time, he spoke first. It has to be faster. We can't wait. This week. Silence on the other end. Then, Friday, 11 o'clock at night. Rear entrance. How many men? 6 is enough, Trent said. I'll handle the inside. You just need to get up to the 38th floor. The call ended. Trent sat for a few more minutes, then began preparing. He opened the guard schedule system on his computer, removed 2 people from Friday night's shift whom he didn't trust, and replaced them with 2 men he knew would obey his orders without asking questions. He entered the camera system and programmed a command to shut off the cameras from the 35th floor to the 40th floor at 10:45 on Friday night, 20 minutes before the outside group came in. He checked the rear entrance code for the basement parking garage, changed it to a new one, and sent it to only 1 number through an encrypted message. He checked the location of Dr. Philip Novak, Jericho's private physician, who usually stayed late in the building on Fridays for the boss's routine health check. Novak would be there. He needed to control Novak too. Step by step, Trent worked calmly and precisely, just as he had done for the past 8 years while running Blackridge's security machine. Only this time, that machine was turning backward against the very man who had built it. Finally, Trent locked his office, went down to the basement, and got into his car. As he drove out of the parking garage, he looked in the rearview mirror. The Blackridge Holdings building stood behind him, 40 floors of glass reflecting the Chicago night sky. In 2 days, that empire would change hands, and Maren Calloway, the cleaning girl who knew too much, would be the last problem he handled after everything was finished. Friday came faster than Trent expected, but not faster than his preparation. At 10:45 that night, the camera system from the 35th floor to the 40th floor shut down automatically, according to the command he had programmed in advance. The monitors in the security room on the first floor still displayed footage, but it was a loop from the previous night, a loop that only the person who set up the system would recognize. The 2 night shift guards Trent had arranged sat in the control room, eyes on the screens, asking nothing. They were paid enough not to ask. At exactly 11 o'clock, the rear door of the basement parking garage opened. 6 men stepped inside, moving quickly and silently. They wore dark clothing, carried weapons, their faces cold. Trent met them at the service elevator, the one office employees never used because it was slow, noisy, and stopped at floors no one wanted to visit. But tonight, it stopped at the 38th floor. The 38th floor was the large conference level, where Jericho often came down to work late when he didn't want to sit in the penthouse. Trent knew that habit. 8 years of watching his boss had given him an exact map of every routine, every path, every hour. He knew that around 11, every Friday night, Jericho would leave the penthouse on the 40th floor, come down to the 38th floor, sit in the large conference room with a glass of whiskey and a stack of documents. Alone. No guards. Because Jericho had never believed he needed protection inside his own building. That night was no different. Jericho sat at the head of the long conference table, a desk lamp casting a warm yellow light across the dark wood, a glass of whiskey more than half finished on his right, documents spread in front of him. He didn't hear them arrive. The conference room doors opened at the same time from both sides. 3 men from the main entrance, 3 from the side door connected to the service corridor. They entered quickly, silently, professionally. Jericho looked up at the sound of footsteps, but it was already too late. 6 armed men surrounded the table. Jericho stood, his chair spinning back behind him, but 2 men were already at his sides. They overwhelmed him with numbers, forced him back into the chair, bound his wrists to the armrests with heavy plastic ties. Fast, clean, no shouting, no prolonged struggle. Jericho resisted, but 1 against 6 in a confined space. The outcome had been decided before it began. In the adjacent room, Dr. Philip Novak was restrained as well. He had been checking the medical cabinet on the 38th floor, preparing for Jericho's routine weekend health examination, when 2 men entered. Novak didn't have time to react. They held him in a chair, guarded him, offered no explanation. The conference room fell silent. Jericho sat in the chair, wrists bound, but his back was still straight, his eyes still open, his breathing still steady. He looked at the 6 unfamiliar men surrounding him, and he didn't recognize a single face. They weren't his people. Then the main door opened again. Trent Sawyer stepped in. He wore a black suit, a folder in his hand, walking slowly and confidently, as though he were entering a Monday morning meeting to deliver a security report. He pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table, sat down, and placed the folder on the surface. Jericho looked at Trent. There was no surprise on his face. No panic, no fear, only a strange stillness, like the surface of a lake before a storm. "Trent," Jericho said, his voice low and even, as though they were speaking in an ordinary meeting. Trent didn't answer immediately. He opened the folder, turned it toward Jericho, a document transferring control of Blackridge Holdings. Jericho Ashford's name on the signature line, blank, waiting. "Sign it," Trent said. "It's that simple. Sign, and you can go wherever you want. I don't want to make this difficult for you." Jericho looked down at the papers, then back up at Trent, and he asked, in a voice that didn't change even a fraction, calm enough to make all 6 armed men in the room uneasy. 8 years. "How much did I pay you in 8 years, Trent?" The question hung in the air. No one answered. Trent's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that the man tied in front of him would ask that question in that tone, in the voice of a boss evaluating an employee, not a captive begging for mercy. He wanted to see Jericho afraid. He needed to see Jericho afraid. But those gray eyes looked at him with the one thing Trent hated most in the world: disappointment. "Sign it," Trent repeated, this time his voice louder, sharper. Jericho didn't look at the papers. He looked straight into Trent's eyes and said nothing. The silence stretched. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. Trent stood, grabbed the folder, and threw it straight at Jericho's face. The white pages scattered, falling across the table, onto his lap, onto the floor. Jericho didn't close his eyes. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, white pages falling around him, his gray eyes still locked on Trent. "Convince him," Trent said to his men, his voice shaking with anger, not fear. "Convince him until he understands those 8 years are over." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Jericho Ashford alone among 6 unfamiliar men in the dim conference room, the transfer papers scattered white at his feet. And somewhere below, on the 36th floor, Marin Calloway was pushing her cleaning cart down the corridor, unaware that above her, the world was collapsing. Marin was wiping the glass in a small conference room on the 36th floor when she heard the sound. Not a loud noise, not an explosion or a scream, just a faint series of vibrations passing through the ceiling, the kind you could only feel when the whole building was completely silent. Quick footsteps, many people, moving all at once above her. Then the sound of something striking the floor hard, dull and heavy, like a chair being knocked over. Maren stopped. She stood still, cleaning cloth in hand, listening. After 11 o'clock at night, the Blackridge building was a dead block of concrete. There was no one on the upper floors except Jericho in the penthouse, on the 40th floor, and possibly Dr. Novak if it was Friday. There was no reason for so many footsteps to be moving fast above the 36th floor at this hour. Maren took the radio from her belt, pressed the shared channel, and called the security room. "Control room, this is Maren, 36th floor. I heard an unusual noise above me. Is anyone checking it?" Static. Silence. No one answered. She waited 10 seconds, then called again. "Control room, do you copy? Answer me." Silence. Only the dry crackle of static in the radio. In 4 years of working the night shift at Blackridge, the control room guards always answered. Always. Even if they were dozing off, even if they were playing games on their phones, they still answered because it was mandatory procedure, and Trent Sawyer would fire anyone who missed a call. No answer meant something was wrong. Maren stood in the dark corridor of the 36th floor. The automatic lights had shifted into energy-saving mode, leaving only weak streaks of light along the walls. The radio in her hand stayed silent. Above her, the vibration had stopped. Everything was quiet again. But it wasn't an ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of things being hidden. Maren knew she could go back to the elevator, press the basement button, go down to the employee break room, lock the door, pretend she hadn't heard anything, hadn't known anything, wait until 6 o'clock in the morning, until her shift ended, and go home. No one knew she had been on the 36th floor tonight. No one would ask what she had heard. She was only the cleaner. No one expected the cleaner to do anything except clean. She stood there, one hand gripping the radio, the other gripping the handle of her cleaning cart. And in that silence, she thought of the basement break room, the white plastic chair, the steaming bowl of soup, the man who had sat across from her at 3 o'clock in the morning, eating every last drop of soup, then nodding before he left. She thought of the gray eyes looking at her through the steam, the first time anyone had seen that she was truly there. She thought of the hand holding out a white handkerchief when she was cut, the hand that an entire city feared, but that night had simply offered a cloth to someone who was bleeding. Maren let go of the radio and let it fall back into the clip on her belt. She let go of the cleaning cart handle. She walked toward the stairwell, opened the door, and began climbing. Each concrete step echoed beneath her heavy footsteps. Steady, slow, but never stopping. 37th floor, 38th floor. She pushed open the stairwell door and stepped into the corridor on the 38th floor. At the end of the hall, light spilled from the crack beneath the large conference room door, and Maren Calloway, the night shift cleaner whose name no one bothered to remember, walked straight toward that light. Maren placed her hand against the glass surface of the conference room door. The glass was cold beneath her palm. Inside, through the frosted pane, she could see shadows, many shadows, and one person sitting motionless at the head of the table. She pushed the door open. The heavy glass door slid aside, and everything inside appeared all at once. 6 armed men turned to look at her. The yellow desk light fell across unfamiliar, tense faces. At the head of the table, Jericho Ashford sat in the chair, his wrists bound to the armrests, his suit wrinkled, his hair fallen over his forehead, but his back still straight, his eyes still open. And standing right beside him, one hand still resting on the back of Jericho's chair as if marking ownership, was Trent Sawyer. The whole room froze. No one had expected the door to open at that moment. No one had expected the person walking in to be a woman in a cleaning uniform. Trent was the first to react. He looked at Maren, and for half a second, something appeared on his face that Maren had never seen in Trent Sawyer before. Confusion. It lasted only half a second, then vanished, replaced by anger. "Who let you up here?" Trent roared. Maren didn't answer. She stepped into the room and walked past the 2 men standing near the door. They didn't stop her. Not because they were letting her pass, but because they didn't know what to do with a woman in a cleaning uniform walking straight toward the bound crime boss. Maren moved past the long conference table, past the white transfer papers scattered across the floor, and stopped directly in front of Jericho. Then she turned around. Her back faced Jericho, her face turned toward Trent. She stood between them, broad-shouldered, large, framed, taking up nearly all the space between Jericho's chair and the edge of the table. She looked straight into Trent Sawyer's eyes. She didn't tremble, didn't shout, didn't cry. When she spoke, her voice was even clear and so steady that all 6 armed men in the room seemed to forget they were holding weapons. "I know what you're doing, Trent." Trent flinched slightly, not from fear, from surprise. She had just used his name. Not Mr. Sawyer, not Sir, head of security. Just Trent, blunt and direct, as if she were looking through the suit, through 8 years of false service, through everything he had tried to hide. "I saw what you threw in the trash," Marin continued, her voice neither louder nor softer, steady as the ticking of a clock. "The numbers, the names, where the money was going, whose hands it reached. I saw all of it." Marin paused for one beat, then she added one sentence, the sentence that would change the entire balance of power in that room. "And I'm not the only one who knows." Silence, the kind of silence in which you could hear the clock on the wall running. Trent stared at her. His eyes narrowed. He was calculating, quickly, frantically. Was she telling the truth or lying? Had she already shown someone? Who was the someone else she had mentioned? Police? A lawyer? Or someone inside the organization? If she was telling the truth, then everything he had prepared for months was hanging by a thread. If she was lying, then she was the most reckless person he had ever met. But Trent wasn't a man who accepted risk, and he wasn't a man who could keep calm when cornered. "Drag her away," Trent shouted, his voice cracking, his hand pointing at Marin. "Drag her out, now!" One of the 6 men stepped forward, grabbed Marin's arm, and shoved her hard to the side. Marin lost her balance. Her heavy body staggered. Her right shoulder struck the glass wall of the conference room. Then she fell to the floor. When her right hand hit the marble floor to brace the fall, the old cut in her palm, the cut from the night she had knelt to pick up broken glass in Jericho's office, opened again. Not large, not deep, but enough for blood to seep out, bright red, dripping 1 drop at a time onto the polished marble floor of the 38th floor. Blood dripped onto the marble floor of the 38th floor of Blackridge Holdings, but not from the man tied to the chair. Marin lay on her side on the floor, her right hand wet with red, her shoulder aching sharply, but her eyes remained open. She looked up, through the shadows of the men standing around her, searching for one pair of eyes. And she found them. Jericho Ashford was looking at her from the chair where he was bound. And in that moment, everything on his face changed. The calm disappeared. The strange stillness he had kept since the moment he was restrained, since Trent entered, since the transfer papers were thrown into his face, that stillness shattered. What replaced it wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something more primitive, deeper, more dangerous. Jericho Ashford's gray eyes, the eyes no one dared look into for more than 3 seconds, were now burning. Jericho didn't roar. He didn't yank against the restraints. He didn't lunge forward like a caged animal. He did the opposite. He settled back in the chair, spine straight, drew a long breath, and began to speak. His voice was low, slow, each word falling into the tight air of the conference room like drops of water on a frozen lake. He didn't look at Trent. He looked at the 6 men standing around the room, and he called a name. "Kendrick." The man near the main door flinched. He hadn't expected the man bound to the chair to know his name. But Jericho knew. Jericho knew everything. "Last year, your daughter needed surgery. The insurance refused to pay. Who called the hospital at 11 o'clock at night to make sure the operation went ahead? Did Trent call, or did I?" Kendrick didn't answer, but he swallowed, and the weapon in his hand lowered by an inch. Jericho turned to the second man, the one in the corner with his back against the glass wall. "Webb, the apartment you're living in on Halstead Street. Who signed the lease for you when no one would take you because of your record? Who do you pay rent to every month? To Trent? Or to me?" Webb lowered his eyes. Jericho didn't stop. He turned to the third man. "Ford, your brother owed $40,000. Who erased that debt? Who made the call to have it forgiven?" Name after name, sentence after sentence, each detail precise as a surgeon's blade, cutting through the thin layer of loyalty Trent had bought with money and promises. Jericho didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded them. He reminded them that before Trent gathered them for tonight, there had been someone else who kept their lives from collapsing. And that man was sitting bound in front of them. Then Jericho asked, his voice unchanged, not louder, not softer, steady as a clock. Do you think Trent would do the same for you? When this is over, do you think he'll remember your daughter's name, your home address, your brother's debt? Or are you just 6 names he'll forget before morning? Silence, the kind heavier than any shout. Kendrick lowered his weapon completely, letting it hang at his side. Webb took a step back, leaving his position, pressing himself against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. Ford looked at Trent, then at Jericho, then down at his own hands, and slowly set his weapon on the table. 3 men. In less than 2 minutes, Jericho Ashford, with words alone, from a chair he was tied to, had taken half of Trent Sawyer's force away. "What are you doing?" Trent shouted, his voice cracking, his face flushed dark. "I pay you. You follow my orders." No one looked at him. No one answered. Trent turned to the remaining 3, the ones who hadn't lowered their weapons, though their eyes had already begun to waver. "Hold your positions," Trent barked. "No one steps back. That's an order." In that moment of chaos, while Trent spun in the center of the room trying to hold control, Kendrick moved. No one noticed. He stepped behind Jericho's chair, reached for the plastic restraint, and pulled. The ties were strong, but Kendrick had a small knife in his pocket, something Trent had issued to each man before they entered the building. One cut. The plastic snapped. Jericho felt his right wrist come free. Then his left. He didn't rush. He rose slowly, flexing his hands, feeling blood return to fingers gone numb. Then he stepped away from the chair and stood upright. The room fell silent. Jericho Ashford stood in the center, his suit wrinkled, his hair fallen, red marks circling his wrists. But he stood straight. And when he stood, all 6 men in the room, including the 3 who hadn't lowered their weapons, felt the weight of that presence. He walked toward Trent, step by step, slow and even. Trent stepped back. His spine met the edge of the conference table. He drew his weapon, raised it, pointed it at Jericho. His hand trembled. Jericho didn't stop. He came within a yard of Trent, looked straight into the muzzle aimed at his chest, then spoke, his voice so low only Trent could hear it. "Go ahead, Trent. Shoot right now. Then look around and see if anyone in this room is still standing with you." Trent glanced around. Kendrick had already set his weapon aside, standing by the wall, eyes on the floor. Webb stood frozen, hands at his sides. Ford had backed toward the side door. The other 3 stood scattered, weapons in hand but not aimed at anyone, faces uncertain, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. Trent stood alone, the weapon in his hand shaking. Sweat ran down his temple. He looked back at Jericho. Those gray eyes still held him, unblinking, unyielding. And then, just as Trent was about to lower his weapon, just as it seemed everything might be over, 2 of the remaining 3, the last men still loyal to Trent for reasons of their own, lunged forward. They grabbed Jericho's arms, pulled him back, forced him to the floor, pinned him down, fast, clean. Jericho fought, but 2 against 1, after he had been bound for over an hour. His wrists numb, his body not yet recovered. They overpowered him, restrained him again, tighter this time, dragging him back into the chair. Trent was breathing hard, the weapon still trembling in his hand. He looked at the last 2 men who remained loyal to him, then at Jericho, bound once more in the chair. And on the conference room floor, a few yards away, Marin Calloway still lay on her side, blood from her right hand falling in steady drops onto the marble, her eyes open, seeing everything. It wasn't over. Trent stood in the middle of the conference room, breathing hard, looking around at the chaos he had created. Jericho was bound again in the chair, tighter than before, the last 2 loyal men standing guard on either side. Marin lay on her side in the corner, her right hand wrapped in the hem of her uniform to stop the bleeding. The remaining 3 men stood scattered, not fully with Trent, not fully with Jericho, simply waiting to see who would win. Trent needed Jericho to sign the papers. That was the only purpose of tonight. Without the signature, the entire plan would be nothing more than an armed break-in, and Trent would go from a man staging a takeover to a criminal. He looked at Jericho. The man was still frighteningly calm, though his wrists were marked red and his face was paler than before. Trent needed him conscious, needed him steady enough to hold a pen, and needed that signature to look legitimate. He turned toward the door of the adjacent room, where Dr. Philip Novak was being held, and shouted, "Bring the doctor in." The door opened. Dr. Philip Novak stepped into the conference room, his hands raised to shoulder height, an armed man behind him. Novak was a man in his 60s, gray-haired, thin, wearing glasses, looking more like a university professor than the private physician of a crime boss. But the eyes behind those lenses were sharp, and when he entered the room and saw Jericho bound to the chair and Marin on the floor, he didn't panic. He simply observed, quickly and precisely, the way he examined a patient. "Check Ashford," Trent ordered. "I need him conscious. I need him able to sign." Trent pointed toward Jericho, then flicked his hand dismissively toward Marin, as if brushing away a fly. "She's not your concern." Novak looked at Trent. Then he looked at Marin. She was trying to sit up, leaning against the glass wall, her right hand pressed into the blood-soaked fabric, her face pale but her eyes still clear. Then he looked at Jericho. Bound, wrists marked, but no open wounds, no bleeding, fully conscious. Novak turned back to Trent and spoke in a steady voice, not loud, not soft, as if he were speaking to a stubborn patient in a clinic. "I'm a doctor. I treat the one who needs it first, not the one you need." Trent stepped forward, his face flushed. "Do you understand the situation? I'm giving you an order." "I understand the situation very clearly," Novak replied, his tone unchanged. "The man in the chair is restrained but not injured. The woman on the floor is bleeding. I'll treat the one who is bleeding first. That's not taking sides. That's medicine. Do you want me to do something to you right now?" Trent roared, stepping close, less than a yard between them. Novak didn't step back. He looked straight at Trent, adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose, and said slowly, clearly, "If you kill the only doctor in this building at midnight, who's going to keep your boss conscious enough to sign those papers?" Silence. Trent stood there, jaw tight, breath hot, eyes fixed on Novak. But the old man behind the glasses didn't blink, and Trent knew he was right. If Jericho collapsed before signing, everything would be meaningless. And if Novak was gone, no one in this room knew how to keep Jericho awake long enough. "Make it quick," Trent said through his teeth, stepping back. 5 minutes. Novak didn't respond. He turned his back on Trent, walked across the room, and knelt beside Marin. He opened the medical bag the guard had brought in, took out gauze, bandage, and antiseptic. He took Marin's right hand, gently unwrapped the strip of uniform fabric, and examined the cut. "Not deep," Novak said softly. "Just enough for Marin to hear, but it needs to be wrapped properly. If you move too much, it'll open again." He began cleaning and bandaging the wound. Trent stood a few yards away, eyes on his watch, his foot tapping against the floor. The 2 men guarding Jericho remained still. The other 3 lingered in their uncertain positions, not knowing where to look. No one paid attention to the old doctor kneeling beside the cleaning woman, and that was when Marin acted. As Novak leaned close to her hand to wrap the gauze, Marin tilted her head, her mouth near his ear, and whispered, very soft, very fast. Just a few sentences. Novak continued wrapping, his hand steady, his face unchanged, but his eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. Then he gave the faintest nod, so small no one saw it except Marin. He finished the final layer of gauze, secured it with medical tape, then stood. "Done," Novak said to Trent in a normal voice. "I need to go down to the medical room to get additional medication for Ashford. If you want him conscious enough to sign, I need a mild neural stimulant. The medical room is on this floor. 2 minutes." Trent looked at Novak, weighing it. Then he nodded, signaling one of his men. "Go with him. Don't take your eyes off him." Novak picked up his medical bag and walked out of the conference room, the guard close behind, and inside the room, Marin Calloway leaned against the wall, her right hand freshly bandaged, watching the old doctor disappear through the door. She didn't know if the plan would work. She didn't know if Novak could pull it off, but she had done the only thing she could do, placed everything into the hands of a man who had chosen to treat her before obeying an order. And sometimes, that was all you had. Novak stepped into the 38th floor hallway, the guard walking close behind him, less than 1 step away. He moved slowly, deliberately slower than usual, his shoulders slightly hunched, carrying the gait of a tired old man in the middle of the night. He needed the man behind him to think he was only a harmless old doctor going to get medicine, nothing more and nothing less. The medical room sat at the end of the 38th floor hallway, about 98 feet from the conference room. Novak opened the door, turned on the light, and stepped inside. The room was small and neat, with 2 supply cabinets, 1 examination bed, and a medicine cabinet with a coded lock in the farthest corner. Novak walked to the first supply cabinet, opened it, took out a metal box containing an IV set, then turned and handed it to the guard. "Hold this for me," he said in a normal voice. "It's heavy, and my hands are shaking." The guard looked at the metal box, then at him. He took it. Novak turned back to the cabinet, took out a bag of IV fluid, 2 packs of gauze, a roll of medical tape, and loaded all of it into the guard's arms. The guard stood there with both arms full of medical supplies, unable to free his hands. Novak walked toward the coded medicine cabinet in the inner corner of the room. This cabinet stood behind a small partition, out of sight from the door. "I need to get into the medicine cabinet," Novak said over his shoulder. "Only the doctor has the code. Security procedure, you understand." 2 minutes. The guard watched Novak disappear behind the partition, hesitating. He couldn't put the supplies on the floor to follow him, because Trent would ask why he'd allowed the doctor to move freely. He also couldn't squeeze behind the narrow partition with both arms full, so he stayed where he was and waited. Behind the partition, Novak entered the medicine cabinet code. The door opened. He took out 2 small vials and placed them on top of the cabinet. Then his hand reached above it, toward a gray plastic box mounted on the wall, dusty and unlabeled. The internal intercom system. Marin had told him about it in those few whispered seconds in the conference room. The old communication system between technical rooms, installed when the building was first constructed, had long ago been removed from every security diagram. But it had never been dismantled. Only long-time cleaning staff knew it existed, because they had once used it to call each other between floors when the elevators broke down. Trent Sawyer, head of security for 8 years, the man who controlled every camera, every door code, every communication system in the building, didn't know this gray plastic box still worked, because it wasn't part of his system. It belonged to the system of invisible people. Novak opened the plastic cover. Inside was a small old keypad, but the power light still glowed green. Marin had given him the call code. Press the basement server room number, hold for 3 seconds, wait for the signal. Novak pressed it. A faint crackle, then a sleepy, startled voice came through the small speaker. "Who's there? What is this?" Eddie Munoz, the night shift IT employee. Sitting in the basement server room, probably just waking after dozing off over his keyboard. "Eddie," Novak said, his voice low and quick, every word clear. "This is Dr. Novak. Listen to me and don't ask questions. Trent Sawyer has betrayed us. He brought outside men into the building. Jericho is restrained on the 38th floor. Marin is injured." Silence on the other end, then the sound of Eddie swallowing. "Marin sent information to you through me," Novak continued. "Camera backup files. Look in the secondary server system, the reserve partition. Trent shut off the main cameras, but the automatic backup is still running on a separate server. Pull that data. Trent's financial system access code. Check the transaction logs on the 35th floor under his login. Marin said you'd know how to find it." Novak paused for a second, listening for movement behind the partition. The guard was still standing there, unmoving. He continued, lowering his voice further. "Send everything to this number." He read out a phone number Marin had whispered to him, the number of Jericho's ally outside. "Then call the police. Report an armed intrusion. Give the building address, 38th floor." Silence. Then Eddie spoke, his voice shaking but alert. "Dr. Novak, if I do this and Trent wins..." "If Trent wins tonight," Novak cut in, his voice cold and clear, "you're the next one removed tomorrow morning. You hold the server data. You know too much. Do you think Trent will leave you alone?" 3 seconds of silence. Then Eddie answered, clipped and firm. "I understand. I'll do it now." Novak closed the intercom cover, picked up the 2 vials from the top of the cabinet, and stepped out from behind the partition. The guard was still standing there, both arms full of supplies. "All done," Novak said in a normal voice, raising the 2 vials. "Let's go." They left the medical room and walked back down the hallway toward the conference room. Novak moved slowly, shoulders hunched, the posture of a tired old man. But inside the pocket of his white coat, his heart was beating faster than it had at any time in 30 years of medicine. And in the basement, 15 floors below, Eddie Munoz had sat upright at his keyboard, hand on the mouse, eyes fixed on the server screen, and begun to work. The server room in the basement was always cold, because the air conditioning ran constantly to protect the machines. But that night, Eddie Munoz felt colder than usual. His hands trembled as they hovered over the keyboard, not from the temperature, but from what he had just heard through an old intercom box, the private doctor of the boss telling him the building was under siege, the boss was tied up, and Marin was bleeding. Marin, the woman who had hidden him in the basement break room 3 months earlier when he fell asleep on duty. The woman who hadn't said a word to anyone even though one sentence would have cost him his job. Eddie stared at the screen, drew in a breath, and began to type. The first task was the cameras. Eddie opened the main surveillance system. Just as Novak had said, the cameras from the 35th floor to the 40th floor were black. Trent had shut them down. But Eddie knew something Trent didn't. The automatic backup system ran on a separate server, a reserve unit installed when the building was first constructed, operating independently from the main system. It overwrote data every 72 hours, and no one checked it because no one remembered it existed except the IT team. Eddie accessed the backup server, located the storage partition for floors 35 through 40. The data from that night was still recording. He could see everything. The footage of 6 armed men entering through the basement rear door at 11. The footage of Trent meeting them at the service elevator. The footage of the group moving up to the 38th floor. Everything clear, time-stamped, Trent's face in frame after frame. Eddie extracted all of it and compressed it into a single file. The second task was financial transactions. Eddie switched to the internal system and accessed the transaction logs from the 35th floor under Trent's login. He didn't have to search long. Marin had been right. The outgoing transfers were there, not heavily encrypted because Trent had believed no one but him had access to that section. He had forgotten that IT had access to everything. Eddie gathered it all into the same file and labeled it with the date and the name Trent Sawyer. The third task was sending it out. Eddie opened his email, attached the file, and sent it to the number Novak had read to him, the number of Jericho's ally outside. He didn't know who the recipient was. He didn't need to know. He only needed to press send. The message went out. Then Eddie picked up the desk phone, dialed 9 to reach an outside line, and called the police. His voice trembled but stayed clear. Black Ridge Holdings Building, West Wacker Street. Armed intrusion, 38th floor. Someone is injured. Send units now. He hung up and sat there breathing. 2 minutes. Everything had happened in 2 minutes. Now he waited, but he didn't wait long. Jericho Ashford's allies weren't the kind who waited until morning. 15 minutes after Eddie's call, the server room phone rang. Eddie answered, and the voice on the other end was brief. Open the basement rear door, now. Eddie ran into the basement hallway, swiped his card, and opened the rear garage entrance. 4 men stepped inside, quick and silent. They wore no uniforms, no insignia, spoke little. One of them looked at Eddie and asked simply, 38th floor? How many up there? 4, maybe 5 left, Eddie said, breath unsteady. 2, guarding the boss. Trent and a few others. The doctor and Marin are up there. The man nodded and asked nothing more. The 4 of them stepped into the service elevator. The steel doors slid shut, and the car rose. Eddie stood alone in the basement hallway, listening to the elevator fade away into silence. On the 38th floor, everything unfolded in less than 3 minutes. The service elevator doors opened. The 4 men stepped out. The last 2 loyal guards of Trent turned, and before they could react, they were restrained, their arms locked, their weapons taken. No shouting, no prolonged struggle, only the difference between professionals and men who were not professional enough. The remaining 3 men in the room didn't resist. Kendrick, Webb, and Ford had already stepped back, hands raised, eyes on the floor. They hadn't wanted to be there from the beginning. Trent Sawyer stood in the corner of the conference room, his back pressed to the glass wall, looking at the 4 men who had just entered. He knew who they were. He knew because he had worked for Jericho for 8 years, and he knew that beyond this building, there were people even he would never dare cross. The weapon in his hand fell to the floor. No one picked it up. No one needed to. One of the allies stepped toward Jericho and cut the restraints. The plastic ties dropped to the floor. Jericho stood, slowly, rotating his wrists for the second time that night. He looked at the man, gave a single nod. No thank you. None was needed. The man nodded back, then signaled the others. They secured Trent's group, collected the weapons, bound Trent and his 2 remaining loyal men, then stepped into the service elevator. The steel doors closed. The elevator descended. By the time the police arrived 20 minutes later, the 4 allies had already vanished through the basement rear door, into waiting cars. dissolving into the Chicago night as if they had never been there. Police sirens cut through the Chicago night 20 minutes after Eddie's call. Red and blue lights swept across the glass face of the Blackridge Holdings building, flashing over 40 floors of steel and glass, as if the whole building were breathing. They came up through the main elevator. 2 teams, weapons drawn, body armor on, radios crackling. But when the elevator doors opened on the 38th floor, there was nothing left for them to do. The conference room was quiet. Trent Sawyer sat on the floor, his hands bound behind his back with the same heavy plastic ties he had used on Jericho. His last 2 loyal men sat beside him in the same position. The other 3, Kendrick, Webb, and Ford, stood in the corner with their hands raised above their heads, faces lowered, ready to cooperate with whoever walked in. The weapons lay neatly on the conference table, arranged in a line, as though someone had cleaned up before the police arrived. The commanding officer looked around the room, assessed the situation within a few seconds, then began giving orders. His team secured the scene, separated each person, and started the procedure. Jericho Ashford stood by the window, his suit wrinkled, red marks around his wrists, his hair fallen forward. He stood still, looking out at the Chicago skyline, both hands in his trouser pockets, as though he were standing in his office on an ordinary night. The commanding officer approached him, notebook in hand. "Mr. Ashford, I need your statement on what happened tonight." Jericho turned, looked at the officer, and said only one sentence, his voice even, his face unchanged. "Ask my head of security. He enjoys explaining things." Then he turned away, finished. The officer looked at Jericho for another moment, then decided to leave it for later. There was enough evidence in the system without needing the victim's testimony. Eddie Munoz had sent everything: the backup camera footage recording the entire intrusion, the financial transactions under Trent's login. All of it was sitting on the server, ready for any investigation. Trent was led out of the conference room, hands cuffed behind his back, walking between 2 officers. As he passed the door, he stopped for half a second and turned his head to look back at Jericho. There was no anger left in that gaze, no defiance, nothing but the emptiness of a man who knew he had wagered everything and lost it all. 8 years, hundreds of secret calls, dozens of hidden transactions, one carefully planned ambush. All of it collapsed because of a cleaning woman who knew how to read what people threw in the trash. Jericho didn't look back at Trent. He didn't need to. The traitor had lost. That story was over. He was turning now, his eyes searching the conference room, searching the corner where the light was weakest. He was looking for Marin. Jericho found her in the corner of the conference room, behind a row of chairs, where the desk lamp's light couldn't reach. Novak was sitting beside Marin on the floor, checking the bandage on her hand again, his medical bag open beside him. Marin sat with her back against the glass wall, her legs stretched out in front of her, her right hand wrapped in white gauze that had turned faintly pink at the edge, her left hand resting motionless on her thigh. Her face was pale, her lips dry, sweat drying on her forehead in a thin layer. But her eyes were open, her eyes were clear, and when she heard footsteps, she looked up. Jericho stood there, a few steps away from her. The conference room light slanted across his shoulder, casting shadow over his face. His suit was wrinkled. 2 red marks from the restraints circled his wrists, and his hair had fallen over his forehead. He no longer looked like the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. He looked like a man who had almost lost everything. Jericho didn't kneel, didn't bend down, didn't hurry. He stepped beside Marin, turned his back to the glass wall, and sat down on the floor, slowly, heavily, as if the entire weight of the long night had dropped onto his shoulders in that moment. He sat right beside her. His shoulder was less than a handspan from hers. His back rested against the cold glass wall, just like hers. The 2 of them sat on the marble floor of the 38th floor, looking out at the empty conference room, the place that had been a battlefield 10 minutes earlier and now held only scattered white papers, a few overturned chairs, and yellow light falling across the dark wooden table. Novak looked at them. He said nothing. He quietly closed his medical bag, stood, stepped aside, and turned toward the window, pretending to arrange a few medicine vials on the sill. He was a doctor. He knew when a patient needed medicine, and when they needed something medicine couldn't give. Silence. Not the silence of tension, not the silence of fear, but the kind of silence that only appears when 2 people have gone through the same long night and don't need words to explain it to each other. Marin didn't look at Jericho. She looked straight ahead, into the space in the middle of the conference room, where only minutes earlier she had stood between him and 6 armed men, speaking straight to Trent Sawyer's face, words she hadn't known she was brave enough to say until they had already left her mouth. Jericho didn't look at her either. He looked down at his hands, at the red marks around his wrists, at fingers still faintly numb from being bound too long. The hands of a crime boss, the hands that had built 40 floors from ashes, the hands no one dared touch. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 2 minutes, no one counted. Then Jericho spoke. His voice was lower than usual, slightly hoarse, as if each word had to pass through something very heavy in his chest before it could get out. I lived 33 years believing no one ever did anything without a purpose. Everyone wanted something. Everyone calculated. No exceptions. He paused, swallowed, then went on, softer. You just proved me wrong. Marin was silent for a while. She didn't turn to look at him. She only sat there, back against the wall, eyes forward. Then she spoke, her voice small, tired, but every word clear. I had a purpose too. Jericho turned to look at her. For the first time since he had sat down, I didn't want to lose the only person who saw me. The sentence fell into the air between them, soft, but heavier than anything that had been spoken in that conference room tonight. Heavier than Trent's threats, heavier than Jericho's questions when he called out each man's name, heavier even than the sound of weapons dropping to the floor. Because it was the truth. The simplest truth. The barest truth. With nothing hidden inside it. For 27 years, no one had seen Marin Calloway. Then one night, a man had offered her a handkerchief when she was cut, and after that, she was no longer invisible. She didn't want to go back. Silence. Jericho looked at her. Marin looked straight ahead. Neither of them said anything more. Then Jericho reached out, slowly, very slowly. His right hand, the wrist still marked by the restraints, the fingers still slightly numb, the hand of a crime boss, the hand an entire city feared, the hand that had never touched anyone without a purpose. He placed that hand over Marin's left hand, gently, as if she were the most fragile thing he had ever held. And he held on. Marin didn't pull away. She didn't look down. She only felt the weight of his hand over hers, warm, real, and there. The two of them sat on the marble floor of the 38th floor of Blackridge Holdings, backs against the glass wall, looking out at the empty conference room, hand in hand. No more words. Outside the window, the Chicago night began to pale. Across the room, Dr. Novak stood facing the windowsill, his hands rearranging the medicine vials he had already arranged, then arranging them again and again, without turning back. He had been a doctor for 30 years. He had seen people live, seen people die, seen people fall and rise again, but he had never seen the most powerful crime boss in Chicago sitting on the floor, holding the night shift cleaner's hand and saying nothing. 3 days after that night, when the marks on Jericho's wrists had begun to fade and the bandage on Marin's hand had been changed for the second time, Jericho invited Marin into his office on the 40th floor. He offered her a place at Blackridge, not as a cleaner, but in another role, higher, more fitting. He didn't specify what position. He only said she deserved more than a cleaning cart and a solitary night shift. Marin stood in front of his desk, her right hand still wrapped in gauze, looked at him for a long time, then said, I didn't save you to get a promotion. She said it softly, without anger, without pride, just the truth, the way she said everything. Then she thanked him, turned, and walked out. Marin left Blackridge the following week. She took the money she had saved from nearly 4 years of night shifts, not much but enough, and rented a small space in the southern outskirts of Chicago, near Bridgeport. She opened a small eatery, not a restaurant, an eatery, 4 tables, 8 chairs, a kitchen just large enough for one person to move around, and a hand-painted sign hung outside the door. She cooked soup, rice, and simple dishes she had made for herself for 4 years in the basement break room. Workers, truck drivers, night shift guards in the area began to come by, because the food was good, the price was fair, and the woman behind the counter always remembered their names. Jericho didn't reach out. No calls, no messages, no flowers, no gifts. But Marin knew he hadn't disappeared. Every night, after she closed the shop, turned off the lights, and stepped onto the sidewalk, she saw a black car parked across the street, about 65 feet from the shop. Always the same spot, always the same time. Lights off, engine idling softly, No one stepping out. Jericho's people. Maren said nothing. She didn't call to ask him why. She only looked at the black car, then turned and walked away. Some nights, she walked a little slower than usual. Then one day, Eddie Munoz called her. Eddie had left Blackridge after the incident and moved to a small IT company in the suburbs, but he stayed in touch with Maren. He called to tell her something. Jericho Ashford had just established a fund for workers, dedicated to those Eddie called the invisible people. Cleaners, night guards, maintenance workers, the ones who worked in the dark to keep the world lit without anyone remembering their names. The fund had a name, the Sullivan Fund. Sullivan, her mother's last name, Margaret Sullivan. The woman Maren had mentioned only once, in the basement break room at 3 o'clock in the morning, over a steaming bowl of soup, when she told Jericho her mother used to cook it that way. Maren held the phone, standing in the kitchen of her small eatery, silent for a long time after Eddie hung up. She didn't go to Jericho, didn't call, didn't write. She just kept cooking, opening the shop, closing it, watching the black car across the street each night. Until one evening, about 4 months later, the shop had closed. Chairs were stacked on tables. Maren was wiping down the stove one last time when she heard the bell above the door. She turned. Jericho Ashford stood in the doorway of the small eatery in the outskirts of Chicago, hands in his trouser pockets, three-piece suit, polished shoes, completely out of place in Bridgeport at 10 o'clock at night. He looked at her and said simply, "Do you have any soup left?" Maren looked at him. Then she turned back into the kitchen without a word. She took down a small pot, turned on the stove, and 5 minutes later placed a steaming bowl of soup on a table near the window. Jericho sat down. Plastic chair, worn wooden table, yellow light, no different from the basement break room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Except this time there was a window looking out onto the street. Maren sat across from him, resting her chin on her hand, watching him eat. He ate slowly, finished everything, then set the spoon down. "Why did you use my mother's name?" Maren asked. Jericho looked at her, silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice low, slow, each word carrying the weight of a man who had lived 33 years without saying these things to anyone. "You taught me that a person with nothing can still give everything. I had everything, and never gave anything to anyone." Maren looked at him. Her eyes shimmered in the yellow light, but she didn't cry. She only smiled. A small smile, beginning in her eyes before reaching her lips. The same smile from that first night in the basement break room. "I'll cook for the fund's opening," she said, "but you have to wash the dishes." Jericho Ashford, the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, the man no one dared look at for more than 3 seconds, the man the entire city knew through fear, sat in a small suburban eatery, looked at the woman across from him, and smiled. Not the cold smile he used in negotiations, not the polite smile he used with guests, but a real one. Small, but real. The second time in his life anyone had seen Jericho Ashford's smile, and just like the first time, the only person who saw it was Maren Calloway, the night shift cleaner no one bothered to remember, who had changed an empire with a bowl of soup made at 3 o'clock in the morning. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories each day. We'd love to hear what you feel deep in your heart. Leave a comment below and tell us how this story made you feel, and whether you think Maren was right or reckless when she stepped into that room. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.
GF pregnant. What happened when get Perginat? 38 plus 2 weeks? Pregnant?
Oh my god, not the grape lady. I did a quiet grape lady for you first. Oh my god, Energy, thank you so much for the subs. And then I got to give you a tour of my postcards and also Jess. Great, I'm Pargant.
Smang is.
Dear?
Let me smang it, girl.
Hi,
Smash it,
hi
bang,
Jess.
bang. Let me smang
For
it,
Jess.
girl.
Okay, this one's for you,
Smash
Jess.
it
I'm
and
so
bang.
sorry.
Smang it, girl. Smash it and bang. Let me smang it, girl.
I'm so
Smash it and bang. Let
sorry.
me smang it, girl.
I'm sorry.
Smash it and bang.
I'm
I work
sorry.
at the gonna make your heart sing.
Dear, thank you. Oh my god. Jess. Jess was doing. I was looking. I was peeking. Squans. Jess was doing a self-portrait. In what medium? Ah, jeez.